Rare diseases are surprisingly common. They affect up to 10% of the population, mainly children. Only about 5% of the 7,000 or so known rare diseases have treatments. So that makes it a real challenge for families, foundations, pharma companies, anybody trying to do something about it. But there is hope, including the Orphan Drug Act, FDA programs to speed development, advances in genomics, and the digitization and interconnectivity of patient data. Welcome to CareTalk, America's home for incisive debate about healthcare business and policy. I'm David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I'm hosting the podcast solo this week. Fortunately, I have a great guest here, Nasha Fitter. She's co-founder and CEO of FoxG1 Research and VP for Real-World Evidence and Ciitizen Platform at Invitae. She's an expert on rare disease from both the personal and professional standpoint. Nasha, thanks for joining me today on CareTalk.
Thank you for inviting me. Excited for the conversation.
Outstanding. So let's start about rare diseases. I said rare diseases are common. So what are rare diseases and why is it so important to focus on them?
Yeah, this is a great question. Rare diseases are not that rare when you add up all the conditions. And, now we're actually up closer to 10,000 is the latest figure I heard. And they're defined to be a rare disease. You have to have less than 200,000 patients in the United States. But the truth is the majority of rare diseases are actually ultra rare, defined as ultra rare, where you have less than 2,000 patients in the United States. And that is the big chunk of the problem. You have a lot of very small conditions. You don't, the way that capital markets are structured, the cost of drug development, it doesn't align with actually finding therapies for these extremely small conditions. So why are rare diseases important? Number one, it's a public health crisis. When you add up all these small diseases, it's a big number. Every Life Foundation actually put a report out that said they looked at about 400 rare diseases. The cost to the U.S. economy was $1 trillion. And that's direct medical costs, it's loss of productivity, unpaid bills, et cetera. And then you just think of the mental, physical, emotional burden on families. So it's a public health crisis. That's one important reason we need to focus on these ultra rare conditions. The second is that rare diseases are a window into curing larger, complex mainstream conditions. Take Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, why is it so hard to find therapies? Because it's such a complicated condition where multiple genes, many genes are impacted. But if you start looking at rare conditions, the majority of them are what we call monogenic. You have small patient populations. You can actually trial drugs and figure out, we take FoxG1, for example, great. We find out that if we increase FoxG1 expression, memory and cognition improve. FoxG1 is one of the genes impacted in Alzheimer's. Could FoxG1 be a target for Alzheimer's? So you start to be able to actually understand larger conditions. So those are the two reasons that focusing on rare is so critical.
That makes sense. And what are you seeing being done to prioritize rare disease treatment development? It's a challenging, as you said, it's only a few people affected by any one of these rare or ultra rare diseases. So how do you make a priority out of it?
Therein lies the struggle. I don't think we're making enough of a priority. The Orphan Drug Act passed in the 80s was great. It was a great first step. It gave incentives to pharma companies to focus on rare. There's tax incentives. There's, priorities. There's patent exclusivities. So that is all great. But what we've seen happen is pharma companies will focus on large rare diseases like Huntington's, which is closer to that 200,000 mark. They're not focusing on the ultra rare conditions, which again are the majority of the rare diseases that we have today. So I think it was a great first step. I think it needs to be looked at again. There are other things the FDA is doing, but to be honest, not enough. And I also don't believe our current capital markets are set up to find scaled solutions for rare diseases.
So, you mentioned the Orphan Drug Act, which has been around for a while, and that's treating the rare, it's affecting the rare conditions. But as you say, the less rare, but within under the cap is sort of where that goes. And FDA, in terms of accelerating approvals or making it easier to get into trials, what are some of those programs? And are those effective, or are those just sort of a footnote?
So in theory, they're effective. Are they being implemented? They are not being implemented. And it's, the Accelerated Approvals Act is amazing because it allows you to literally accelerate your trial. So for an ultra rare condition, you don't have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, mainly phase 3. If you think about a gene therapy for an ultra rare condition, it costs about $75 to $100 million. What pharma company is going to take that when you've got 500 patients? It doesn't make sense. So we have to find ways to do an accelerated approval. And what that basically means is using a surrogate endpoint instead of a clinical endpoint. So if we take the FOXG1 case again, you could say, all right, an increase in protein expression, that's a surrogate endpoint. We're not going to see the clinical manifestation of that for years following. So what the accelerated approval process does is it says, all right, we'll approve you based on the fact that you can increase protein. And then we'll follow patients in post-marketing after approval for 10 to 15 years to then document their clinical successes. This is really powerful. It allows us to skip that very large, pivotal study, the phase 3 study, brings costs down, gets drugs to patients faster. Is it riskier? Absolutely. But when you have patients with fatal conditions, high unmet need, leave it up to the patients to make the decision whether they want to take that risk. And unfortunately, it's not being implemented fast enough. You have a lot of pharma companies. Ultragenyx is leading the charge there. Praxis Precision Medicines pushing the FDA. And what's unfortunately happening is a lot of companies are either dropping programs or they're taking that clinical trials to Europe, which, we're seeing the accelerated approvals being done in Europe. And that's not good news for US patients.
So when you talk about the surrogate endpoints, I know there's been some controversy about that, maybe less in the ultra rare side, but maybe with less rare conditions, maybe in oncology, you have things that are approved with surrogate endpoints. And then, in the end of the day, do they really work out? And they are expensive. Here, I think you're drawing a different distinction, which is you've got a fatal condition with no treatments approved, and the sort of the risk reward balance is a little bit different.
It's all about your unmet need and what is the risk. And if your unmet need is greater than the risk, you should be able to do an accelerated approval. And again, it's up to the patient. Do you want to, or the caregiver? Is this a risk you're willing to take? And just to be clear, these drugs are going through toxicology first. We're testing safety first. It's efficacy we're talking about.
Talk about some of the other challenges or, innovations with doing clinical trials when you've got small patient populations. So I imagine that, if we're doing a trial of blood pressure, I might have a placebo control. If you've got a fatal illness, you probably don't want a placebo control. You don't want to be in that arm of it. There's not enough patients. So what are some of the special considerations?
Yeah, I feel like all I'm doing is talking about bad news on this podcast, but there are a lot of great innovations happening. But so
I'll have to ask questions that lead themselves in that direction next. But stay tuned.
The placebo arm is another big part of the accelerated approval trial, right? The process, which is, can you use a patient's own natural history study as their own placebo? Like you mentioned, you have a gene therapy, a neurological condition. You have to inject a child either in their spine or under their, in the neck area, right under their brain. What caregiver is going to sign their child up where there's a 50% chance they could be a placebo? It's never going to happen. And so this is what we're seeing. Yeah. So in addition to it being so expensive, you also can't fill your trial. And these trials don't get filled, they get dropped. It's a huge problem. So again, and what's exciting now is that, and this is, where I got into Ciitizen, but there's many technologies now that are allowing us to collect patient data at a much deeper level. And so using a patient's own information for a natural history study is becoming a reality. We don't necessarily need to do placebos, or we can at least, do a smaller placebo, et cetera. There's ways that we need to think about innovative trial design. The placebo is a huge area. And the good news is that there are a lot of companies innovating in this space, a lot of organizations looking for better endpoints, better biomarkers, and the FDA is open to listen. And I think the FDA basically needs to be convinced.
So just to be clear, so on the natural history side, what that is, we're doing in a placebo-controlled trial, you'd say, here's someone that is otherwise identical, and one is going to get an intervention and one isn't, and we'll compare the difference. Natural history, what you're saying is the patient's on a certain trajectory, and when you have a medication or some sort of a therapy, does it alter the course of their history? So you're comparing the patient with themselves?
Exactly.
Is that the idea? Of course, it's within their own...
It's their synthetic twin. It's their synthetic twin. So it's a patient that's very similar, has the same mutation, who's older. We look at their entire natural history course and we say, all right, the way this is looking at age 10, this patient will still not be able to stand. I'm just putting an example. You have a drug that the patient starts being able to stand. You know that, okay, there's been a therapeutic effect. So it is exactly using the data. And there's enough bioinformatics tools now that can even take a small population of data and extrapolate that so you can have a larger natural history study. Those are the kinds of exciting innovations that are happening that can move us away from, using actual patients as a placebo.
Great. So with the use of patient as a placebo, if you can get them, which we wouldn't even recommend even for ethical reasons, you're throwing away half the data in a sense. And this way, it sounds like there's a few different areas. One is there's better kinds of data that can actually be derived.
Yep.
Sounds like bioinformatic data. There's different ways to manipulate it, and then there's also probably different ways to share it and make it so that it's actually more. You actually can get the whole patient record together. Can you maybe just talk about what are the different components where you're seeing progress?
One of the areas which I find amazing when you have epilepsy trials is they look at endpoints based on a survey that is called a seizure diary that a caregiver takes. I can tell you as a caregiver of a child who has seizures, I know that I'm doing the seizure diary incorrectly. It's very difficult to classify seizures, to know what type of seizures, to get the exact time. But we still do that. This is the endpoint the FDA uses for all epilepsy trials. There's really innovative companies, Beacon Biosignals right here in Boston as an example, looking at actually taking the EEG tracing and analyzing spike burden. They did a very interesting study where they looked at spike burden and then compared it to seizure diaries of the same population. And caregivers are missing hundreds of seizures, right? And they're classifying them incorrectly. So there's really interesting technologies coming out, and that's going to help us understand, are drugs actually effective? Other things that I'm seeing, there's really interesting companies that are sending iPhones home to families' homes saying, just video your children's movement disorders, upload all of these videos to one site. Let's then have a group of experts come and analyze the videos. This is exciting for two reasons. One is you're not taking the child out of their home environment. The second you take a patient out of their home environment, you've already created a placebo. You've already created an issue. They're not acting the same way they normally would, et cetera, et cetera. So they're in the home. You get to see the exact phenotype, the exact symptom. And then you don't have one person evaluating. You have a group of experts evaluating. I mean, it seems so basic. When I talk to you about this in any other industry, you would think this is an obvious solution. But in healthcare, we're still not using technology enough to track patients' symptoms minute by minute, day by day, and then use that tracking in a clinical trial instead of taking people as a placebo. It's just, it boggles. As someone who has come from tech and has not come from healthcare, I think there's a lot more we can do to innovate and make this experience better, and mainly just have clinical trials that are more effective. Even with everything we're doing, the majority of clinical trials fail, vast majority. So we need better ways to track endpoints to make sure that, these drugs actually have a therapeutic effect on patients, track that effect. And so I'm excited about all the innovations.
It sounds like the things that you're describing to increase the precision of the trials actually also may improve the quality of life for the people that are either living with the condition or their caregivers, because, there's probably not too many people better than you who would be able to do a seizure diary, and yet you struggle with it. It also creates guilt for some people if they're, supposed to be trying to do this and they're trying to track a record in addition to being a caregiver, et cetera. So it sounds like some of these things are just also taking the burden off of individuals and also providing more precision, and hope that the trials would actually work as a result.
You've absolutely hit it. A lot of trials, patients have to go into clinic sites or even before the trial to collect enough data. Just getting a patient to travel to an academic center for a site visit is hugely burdensome on patients that are living with really debilitating conditions, right? You've got caregivers with children in wheelchairs. Every time they take them somewhere, they have their feeding tubes. They have to worry they're going to have a seizure while traveling. It's a lot to do just to take them to a center to collect data that could have been collected in their home environment.
So as I had, started at the beginning alluding to it, and you mentioned more and even expanded the number of diseases out there, there's collectively a lot of diseases and a lot of people that are affected by them. Obviously, the cure has to be done presumably at the level of the individual, orphan patient ultra orphan population. But what can be done at a little bit of a higher level? Are there ways that foundations work with one another to aggregate certain things, or is it how does that actually work? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of the rare disease space, is that it is a very collaborative environment. Foundations do work together. Many of my closest friends now run other advocacy groups for monogenic conditions. And so there are many projects that we have done together, that we've pulled together. Anytime that you're doing a project that, like you said, you're not treating the genetic core, you might be taking a downstream target, you can start looking at basket trials. So there's many epilepsy basket trials, for example. There's larger projects that we can do. So there is a lot of, and there's a lot of knowledge sharing between groups on what is working for me, what could work for you, etc. We're about to start an open study for Fintepla, and that was a drug that is, prescribed for LGS, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and Dravet, and now we're able to take those learnings and apply it for FOXG1. So there's a lot of learning and collaboration in the space. It's very important.
Let's talk a little bit about the behavior of the drug companies. You're saying there's some pathways available, maybe from FDA, that aren't being used, or companies abandon them, and you're contrasting it with some other industries. My experience has been that sometimes the companies are actually, less, they have a lower threshold for risk taking, or less of a willingness to believe FDA, whereas FDA is often saying, no, give this a try. Is that the case of what you see as well? Or how do you explain that phenomenon?
150,000%. When I went to Ciitizen, which is a platform we developed to collect medical records, patient medical records, and then extract information from those records and normalize the data. Very simple idea. Creating a natural history study with clinical data so patients don't have to go to an in-clinic site. We're just taking the records they already have. And we started speaking to pharma companies early on, and no one wanted to take the bet, right? No one wanted to invest and then take that data to the FDA because they were worried, will the FDA reject it? But you're right. The FDA wants you to take innovative solutions and then explain to them why the solution, why this data is superior. The FDA truly does want to be educated. All my discussions with the FDA have been very positive. And it is, you're right, the pharmaceutical industry, especially big pharma, there's a lot of risk aversion. And for ultra rare diseases, we have to take some bets. We have to take some risks.
Often in pediatrics in general, I'm not even talking about rare disease, when they're trying to get priorities in the pediatric world, you usually try to interest something that's going on the adult side because it's bigger and better reimbursed. And I heard you go sort of right to that strategy at the start. Maybe it's because you're both educated at one of those schools that teaches you about strategy, but also hopefully because it's true that, if you can, where is there a lot of money spent, right? And a lot of it completely futile on Alzheimer's, for example, and then epilepsy more broadly. And you were talking about these, monogenic conditions being a window into potential treatments. And there's been a lot of frustration on some of the treatments for these more common diseases that affect people that vote and have money. How does that play in practice? I see it's a good rallying call to say, hey, get interested in this, but how do you actually execute that strategy to say, look, this could be a window into Alzheimer's, help us leverage that in a population, that we care about specifically with a particular
David,
syndrome.
If you figure out how to do that, please tell me the trick, because I can tell you for FOXG1, we have really struggled. Even with all the work that we have done, we've de-risked the disease. We've invested in basic science. We've got our natural history together. We've shown that, you can increase protein expression in FOXG1. We're seeing phenotypic rescue in our animal models. It's very difficult, especially in the current financial environment, to get pharma to want to focus on a condition where there's only 600 patients that we know of in the United States. So this is, it comes down. Now there's newer biotech companies that are smaller. Mozi Therapeutics is a great example of a company that is only focused on ultra rare conditions. They're in fact taking on a condition with only 20 patients that they know of. But these companies are far and few between. There's many rare diseases. So it's a gap. I mean, there is a literal gap in the market right now, and our current markets are not providing the incentives to solve that gap.
Let me turn on a little bit. This is related to what we've been talking about, but maybe as a last question, just to ask you a little bit about Invitae and Ciitizen. You're talking about, using advanced techniques to gather the information and to analyze it. What is the state of kind of, record keeping, record gathering for medical records, and how much is it possible really to leverage advanced techniques like, machine learning today to really, take advantage of that? And how much is sort of still on the human abstractors and, bringing paper records together?
Yeah, it's a great question. We started with, first it was just getting the operations down to actually collect these medical records, because it is very difficult for a patient to access their own medical records at this moment in American history. So even though we have the HIPAA right of access, it's quite difficult. So our first order of business was just, let's get that down. And so we finally have that operation where we can use a patient's own HIPAA right of access and collect the entirety of their medical records. So not just what's in the patient portal, but all of the clinic notes, EEG tracings, MRIs, etc. Load them onto a system. So that's step one. And this works very, very well with pediatric neurological conditions, for example, because patients are going to see their doctors pretty frequently. So you can get really rich data. That was the kind of first part of the equation. The second part, as you mentioned, was how much is human abstraction? When we started, it was 100% human abstraction. We've moved forward. We're at about 50% right now, but you're absolutely right. There is still a huge requirement, especially for rare diseases, to have human quality control and human abstraction. Now, I'm hoping with all the innovations we're seeing with ChatGPT and other AI, modularities that we can get better. But right now, the technology is sort of where it is.
Got it. Well, thank you, Nasha. There's plenty more we could be talking about here. This has been very informative, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, that's it for another episode of CareTalk. My guest today is Nasha Fitter from FoxG1 Research and Invitae. We've been talking about rare diseases and what's being done to find much-needed cures. I'm David Williams, president of Health Business Group. If you like what you heard, or you didn't, please subscribe on your favorite channel.